All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about how open source disclosure works and how companies do security disclosure and so on and so forth. And to do that, I think we initially need to start working or looking at what's the life cycle of a cyber attack. So typically, the first thing somebody who wants to attack you will start scanning your systems and your infrastructure and look for weak points. Once they found that, they will try and deliver targeted malware, to your system to get around your defenses, and then they will sit there and collect more information and so on and so forth. And eventually they will then try and achieve their goal. And in that whole process, they will fundamentally use vulnerability, malware, exploits, rootkits, and so on and so forth. They will also use things like techniques like social engineering, so they will try and send, email to people who want to get you to click on things, but we won't focus on that kind of it. So we're really just going to be interested in vulnerabilities and anything related to it. So what's a vulnerability? Well, a vulnerability is ultimately a bug in your software which results on a negative, which has, when it's exploited, has a negative impact either on the integrity of your system, on the availability of your system, or stealing data from you, the confidentiality. Another bit of terminology is what's a patch or a live patch. And then here, this is always a subset. So this is the whole set of vulnerabilities. This would then be the whole set of vulnerabilities with known patches and so on. So this kind of gives you a sense of scale. So a patch basically is a fix for this issue, and a live patch is a fix that can be applied to a running system. So malware is slightly different. So that's basically software in general designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to your system. So this should say unauthorized. And of course, some malware will exploit a vulnerability, but others not. There might be like vulnerabilities which rely on social engineering or just people being stupid. And an exploit, and that's the subset is basically malware which uses a vulnerability. And then we have the concept of a zero-day exploit. So that's an exploit which somebody has been using against your system without you knowing it, and been collecting data and so on and so forth. And then there's the whole concept of a rootkit, and that's basically usually a set of these exploits together, which can run for a very long time on your system to gain and gather information without you noticing it. So that's kind of basic terminology around this. Then we have this thing, so these are all these computer or product security incident response teams. So that's the standard terminology. And usually the abbreviation used here is a CCERT, but sometimes you also see PCERT or CERT and similar terminology. So these teams tend to do 3 groups of activities, and some of these teams are commercial. Obviously Microsoft, Amazon, all these kind of companies have teams like that, also Intel, but also many open source projects have teams like that. So we have the security team as well with Xen Project. So they do a lot of things, but really I'm just going to focus on anything related to vulnerability. So I'm primarily focusing on that. We'll also be doing things in this area as well. So what is the ultimate goal? I guess you could hear me before, but that way I don't have to shout so much. So what do these teams ultimately want to achieve? And I think there's a difference whether you're a product vendor or whether you're a service provider. So if you're a service provider, really you want to ensure that all your product variants, when the information becomes public, are fixed, and you will also want to ensure that the majority of customers deploy it fixed, and some of them might be special important customers to you, and you give them information under NDA beforehand. If you're a cloud provider, you basically want to ensure that your public-facing service is fixed by the time the information becomes public. So that's setting the scene. Do you have any questions at this stage? I'm trying to make this a little bit more interactive. No? Did I do anything wrong? Yeah. All right. So I wanted to look at a few typical patterns which happen in this field. So I tried to gather some of this stuff, but I've been working with various teams over the last few years, and quite often it's really a little bit of a black box. It's quite difficult to see what really happens, and so I thought it would actually be a good topic for a talk to see how this all hangs together. And it's actually quite interesting in many ways. So what will we look at? So we'll basically look at fundamentally kind of activities which happen within one of those teams when a vulnerability is discovered. And we're kind of doing this from a proprietary viewpoint. If you were a proprietary vendor, because you have a lot more control there, in many ways. We'll also look at this whole thing from the perspective of an open source project, and then we'll also look at how those two things fit together. Because when for example, an open source project reports an issue via pre-disclosure list to a commercial security organization, the open source project constrains what the commercial organization can do, and that causes some interesting problems. So, in general, the first pattern, so typically what we always have is a vulnerability is reported to an organization. The first thing they do is check whether that's a security issue. What they then will do, if they determine there is a security issue, they will analyze the issue. So they will try and establish the impact of product releases. If it's a service, they will typically also try and establish their impacted instances instead of the releases. That might also map back onto different product and hardware configurations and so on. They will typically also create POCs and test cases, primarily to help them understand the issue and also, see how far can you infiltrate the systems and so on and so forth. And it also enables you to generate tests at the end of the day to see whether ultimately fix the issue. Quite often this will be manual assessment, sometimes you can automate that. And you will also work on an impact assessment. Then there's a whole set of organizational stuff which is happening. So one of the things which typically happens at the beginning of this process, if you have a discoverer of an issue, they will you will try to negotiate how much time you have. How long can this piece of information be kept secret? So for example, what we do in Xen Project, we have some recommendations, and then we basically go to the discoverer of the issue and say, well, we may want to disclose this issue in 4 weeks. Is that okay with you? Most of the time people say yes, but sometimes they want to disclose stuff earlier for various reasons. The team will then draft an issue description. If it's a large organization, then they need to make sure that resources are available, right? So if you have to, if you have 4 weeks, for example, to fix an issue, and you may have to make sure that your support team is available to, to roll out all these changes. They will also deal with a CVE numbering authority to get a CVE number, and then they'll be working on a final issue description. In parallel to that, that team would work on a mitigation. So develop a fix, do the QA for the fix. If there's live patching, you may have to do something special for live patching and do all the testing around it. And if you have different product configurations, obviously you're going to have backports for these fixes or live fixes. And then you will also have to go, if it's a product company, typically you will have to go through a full QA product cycle, once you apply those different combinations of things. So then there's a few more steps coming. So so there could be deployment, right? So if you have, so this is typically, like deployment is one of the areas which might be resource intensive, particularly if you're a service provider. So you have to make sure that your people are there, do some planning and so on and so forth. You have to package and bundle the fixes up through whatever distribution system you have. This could be as simple as a packaging system, but it could be something quite complex. You're going to have to do QA of the packages, and then you just have to roll the whole thing out. And in the past, for Xen, that meant quite often rebooting machines, so you had to notify customers, reboot windows and all those kind of things that can take quite a lot of elapsed time. And while it all happens, you have to have staff to deal with the customers which might be angry and so on and so forth. And then we have finally, when the information becomes public, there might be a period where, as a commercial vendor, for example, if I discover something in an open source project, I typically make sure I fix everything myself first, and then I go to the project. And so, or there could also be, special customers. I know, for example, that Microsoft, if you're a good customer of them, under NDA, you can get access to fixes they provide before everyone else gets them. So you can do some testing and preparation. And then finally we publish the documentation, and then there's going to be a notification to all the customers. So that's kind of basically a very generic, high-level model of what may happen. Not all of this may happen, so different blocks may happen or not, depending on specific organizations. Some may do a bit more. So, so fundamentally, in this model, we've been assuming that the organization which has been handling the issue has only been constrained by the wishes of the reporter. And that's quite important. If somebody comes to you and reports an issue, you kind of have to please them because you can't control what they do with the information, right? If it's a security researcher who finds an issue and you negotiate with a big vendor, and that vendor pisses you off, you could just publish this stuff and really damage them, right? So as a vendor, you have to really make sure you respect their what they want to do. And that gives you quite a lot of freedoms to do things like, if you have special customers, you can tell them on an NDA, and there's lots of different things you can do. You can even get to the point where you just basically fix it quietly and not tell anyone if it's one of your own people, for example, who has discovered the issue. Now, when you use an open source project, and there's an open source security team involved, most of these things you can't do, right? There will be constraints imposed on you which come from the open source project. And so I wanted to kind of look a little bit at this dynamic, and I also wanted to look a little bit at, so first I wanted to look at actually what the open source project as a general rule does, and then how the two things fit together. So this is just a quick rerun. So this is, an open source project. There's also a CSIRT, a security team, but the process will look slightly different. So of course the project does all the same thing as before. It'll analyze the issue, it'll establish what releases are impacted. Most open source projects don't do POCs, but many do a little bit of test case and so on. But they typically don't have the resources to do the same kind of analysis a big commercial organization does. There's also planning and negotiation going on. Obviously, open source teams are typically quite smaller. They're not a large organization, so they don't have to do the whole planning and making sure resources are there. And typically, if they're not there, then we just delay things, right? If the discoverer lets us do that. When we develop a mitigation, again, we go through all the same steps. So I don't know any open source project right now which actually actively delivers live patches today. I mean, I might be wrong. We, as the Xen Project, we try to make sure that the patches we submit can be built into live patches, but we don't actually deliver live patches because they're fundamentally binaries, and that requires a whole lot of extra testing and depends on compiler versions and so on and so forth, and it's just too painful for a project to do.
You're saying no open source project delivers live patches?
Yeah, that's what I said. Okay. Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know of anyone which does, but I might be wrong, so that's why.
I was going to say Xen server. I mean, but yeah.
Well, but Xen server isn't really an open source project.
No,
right?
That's why I was clarifying. Sorry.
I mean, it isn't. It's a commercial product which has an open source code base that's different to a project. Then there's this whole pre-disclosure period, and this is where the whole thing becomes different. So there's typically a time window during which open source projects tell a privileged group of users information essentially under embargo, and during this time, for example, it's typically a fixed time period. It might be 2 weeks. Some projects have less. OpenStack, I think, is 3 to 5 days. There's different rules there. And also, fundamentally, there's the information is disclosed with some strings attached. So the project typically constrains what the organizations we tell the information can do, right? So most of these open source projects, for example, will not allow you to update your systems if you're a service provider when the information is under embargo. Some projects don't allow different stakeholders who get the information to communicate with each other. So there's all sorts of possible restrictions which can be imposed on you. And once the period is over, basically the information is made public. So projects might use their own communication channel, or they might use something which is shared amongst, in general, like open world OSS security. So now I wanted to look at how does this gel. How do those two models now fit together? Now we almost saw the same templates, right? So we're basically going to have the commercial world sort of has to somehow fit into this window now, and this kind of raises some interesting points and conflicts and so on. So I'm kind of trying to explore that a little bit, and then also we're going to show some examples of how different organizations work around some of the potential issues and what you can do and what you can't do in certain scenarios. But before I do that, I wanted to kind of go back to one of the end goals. So these were the sort of end goals for the two different classes of companies. So I think one thing which I don't think anyone can do when they work within the context of a disclosure of an open source project is to share information to some of their customers under NDA. I've never seen that, and I've never come across of that. And it's kind of interesting because we've seen a few vulnerabilities lately where people shared information on NDAs. And this might cause some problems further down the line for open source projects. And the real point there is, whether an organization can achieve those goals really depends on what the open source project, which gives you the information, allows you to do. So now we have the situation, we have a pre-disclosure period. The bug comes from our open source organization via pre-disclosure list. Obviously the security organization in the commercial part will do a triage as well, right? They will try and see whether the security issue which has been reported to them actually affects them. In many cases it doesn't, but sometimes it does. Also, quite frequently, some of them may decide not to fix something because it's not important enough for them. So there's some organizations which fix everything, and there's some which just, fix higher priority issues and then defer some of the lower priority issues, bundle it up and roll it into the next release. So both things happen. We'll also obviously analyze the issue, so that's all pretty much of what we had before. So there's no change. The main difference is that obviously now you're working against the clock, whereas beforehand, you may have had the opportunity to negotiate with the discoverer how much time you have, and maybe even pay them some money to give you more time and whatever. There's some things which go away. So obviously the commercial organization now can't negotiate with the project because the projects typically have fixed rules. So that's gone away. But with the planning aspect, you're making sure you have the resources and all this kind of stuff still happens. We'll also have to, draft a product-specific description of your issues such that your customers kind of can make sense of what that specific vulnerability means. Then it comes to actually taking the mitigation. So, typically when you get this, there will be a fix available. But quite often commercial organizations have patch queues, they have changes, they have specific configurations of open source projects, and so they may have to adapt the fix, or they may have to backport it to versions which aren't supported. But apart from that, it's pretty much the same sort of activity as you would have before. And then it becomes interesting. Because it becomes different, the process becomes different depending on whether you're a product company which ships a binary to someone, or whether you're a service company which provides a service to someone. And that's kind of so the differences there are quite interesting. So if you're a product company, you'll basically take the fix you have, you will package it, you might bundle several ones. You then have to basically, test your packages, do a QA again, all this kind of stuff. And then, if you're a larger organization, you will have some kind of delivery mechanism, for the packages, and you basically have to make ready, make sure that the delivery mechanisms are ready. You put all your stuff in there, and at some point when you publish, you press a button, and everyone gets an email and can download, the packages, and then your users can install them. And then you publish, and the whole thing is out. And you would publish at the same time when the project does. If it's a service provider, you may also have to do some packaging because you use an internal packaging system or whatever, but that's then primarily a carrier mechanism. And if, for example, you can update your systems during the embargo, then you have to, then there's a lot of machinery which kicks in, like identifying which virtual machines or which customers, actually need to be updated and so on. All this stuff is not really, it's not trivial to do that. And Actually, it's quite interesting. I think live patching makes a really big difference, because if you look at the time, you know, it probably just takes a few minutes to, well, less than a minute to apply a live patch. Is that right? In practice?
Sometimes you can build them like that.
Yeah, but it's significantly quicker than rebooting a host.
It's substantially quicker than 1 second.
Yes, so probably, you know, you could actually do this, you know, like probably, you know, if you had a few hours before the embargo date ends, you could still get away with it, depending on the size of, you know, the company and how many customers are affected. Whereas, you know, if you had to reboot, it will probably take days, you know, where you need to do that, and you need a lot more preparation time. And if that time period is too small, then it's obviously going to cause a problem.
Months. Try months, not days.
Pardon?
Try months.
Months. Oh.
Experience.
Well,
rebooting a cloud takes a very, very long time.
Yeah, I mean, true.
I can't tell you who from, but one cloud takes 22 months.
They're not in the building, are they?
Sorry?
They're not in the building, are they?
Yeah, but it's being recorded, so you know, I have to be quite careful about what I say. So really, this is just summarizing some of the questions which really come up, of which some of the restrictions, you know, which may be imposed on us. The biggest one is actually, as a commercial organization, can I actually get this information, right? And there's quite widely different models in open source projects. Some are very specific and narrow, and some are a bit wider and more relaxed. Like in the Xen Project, we're fairly relaxed in terms of who we allow on a pre-disclosure list. As long as you use Xen and you know, follow certain minimum standards, you can get that information. And I remember, you know, there was a lot of debate around this, because it was seen as very risky, but we have been actually pay, even though we have 75 organizations on this project. The other big thing is around the timetable, right? Things like, when is an issue pre-disclosed? Are they bundled together? You know, how long is the pre-disclosure period? All those kind of things. The next set of questions and restrictions are around, what can you do with that information, right? Can you make a deployment under embargo? Are you allowed to communicate to affected customers? You know, can you actually tell, you know, if you're a cloud provider, can you tell your customers that they have to do a reboot during a pre-disclosure period, or that they can expect one? Are you allowed to collaborate with other people on that list? And then there are things like technical things, like, you know, like an open source project may not be able to do things because they have a smaller scale than, you know, than commercial organizations can, and they can have interactions. So let's look at some specific examples here, right? So let's look at the service provider example and really look at some of the differences. There's Linux, distros OpenWall. That's an organization of various distros. It's not an organization, it's a mailing list where distro vendors collaborate, and there's some rules around this. We use the Xen Project, and there's OpenStack. So OpenWall, you have to be a distro to be on that. So, you know, if you're a service provider and you don't have a distro, you can't get onto that list. We allow public services, distros, products, and large users. And OpenStack pretty much allows anyone who's a downstream of a certain size to be on a pre-disclosure list. But the difference there is their disclosure period is very short. It's only 3 to 5 days. So that's how they have an even larger pre-disclosure list as Xen. So this of course means that you know, if you're a service provider or cloud provider and you don't also maintain your own distro, you cannot get that information. And that could put you at a commercial disadvantage. So some of the bigger ones get around that by maintaining their own distros. So you can see, for example, Amazon is on that because they have Amazon Linux. Oracle is on that because they have Oracle Linux. And then there's this Cloud Linux thing, which is kind of, there seems to be a service provider, they seem to provide a service to other service providers where you can basically buy updates as a service kind of thing. So they provide live patching services for other service providers. But I don't know that much about it. So I wanted to look a little bit about at the Xen Project here, and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to, so we started 10 minutes late. I'm going to ask somebody to walk over and see how they're doing this time. So our policy is here. We have quite a large pre-disclosure list. And we haven't had a single issue with information leaking since we introduced this policy 4 years ago. The second question was around who allows updating of public-facing systems during an embargo. Well, Linux distros only in very rare cases. Xen Project, we allow this generally, unless there's a good reason not to, which is typically if the discoverer objects to that issue, or there's another good reason. It hardly ever happens. OpenStack, I don't know. I couldn't find any information about that, but maybe you guys can. Oh, you don't know either. Interesting. Pardon? They're still going. Okay. All right. And basically, we added this specifically to our policy to help service providers, and that's actually been a really good thing for the project because most cloud and service providers, hosting providers, really like that because it helps them. There's another interesting wrinkle around this, and this is what happens if you have. So this is the open source project. This is a commercial vendor, and a commercial vendor sells the product to a service provider. Right? What happens in that situation? If this wasn't an open source project, these guys could tell those guys under NDA or some other commercial arrangement, and this would all work, right? Now, if the project kind of doesn't allow you that, that generally puts customers of the product company at a disadvantage. So how could you work around this, right? So this is just showing us here. Well, in a Xen project, we get around this by basically allowing service providers who use Xen, even if they're using Xen, which is not the open source product variant, but it comes from somebody else, like Oracle, SUSE, or whatever, they can also be on a pre-disclosure list. So that removes that kind of problem. So that means, as a minimum, they can start planning deployment and get their things ready. To be able to effectively use this, there also needs to be there needs to be communication, or communication between those two parties needs to be allowed. And we also allow that within the project. And then it's up to the two vendors, to actually organize all the details to see how that works. But having a communication channel like this is actually also interesting, because quite often what happens is vendors really help each other on the list. So we have, quite frequently, we have cases where one vendor backports to an older version of Xen, which isn't security supported anymore, and then they just post their patches to everyone else, and so that's actually kind of quite good. Timing, just summarize this quickly. I don't know what the timing on open for distros is. I have no idea how this works.
Very strictly, no more than 2 weeks.
No more than 2 weeks. Okay.
Unless it's something extraordinary.
But that's kind of pretty much what we do more or less as well. So we're not totally strict about it.
Normally, the expectation is it's 3 to 5 days.
Okay. Also, this is so normally 5 days, but not more than. Okay, that's it.
Basically, if you want to choose an embargo longer than 5 days, you've got to justify why it's longer than 5 days.
Okay.
And only truly extraordinary stuff can go longer than 2 weeks.
Okay. I'll update that. OpenStack also 3 to 5 days. I think that's probably quite challenging, also from a deployment perspective. And we typically do this every 2 weeks, and for the last 6 to 9 months we've been experimenting with batching things. And we will also, there is a discussion about reviewing the effectiveness of our process going on at the moment, and I'm having a general process kind of design session probably sometimes tomorrow where we can discuss some of those things and I can gather your input. Is the session over?
Going to check what was the...
So how far are they behind?
Already 5 minutes should be enough.
Okay, so I'm going to rush a little bit. So I'm
you are not ready. Okay.
Actually, in that case, so there's there's a bit more stuff I didn't time that presentation, unfortunately. So I was going to talk about some challenges around multi-vendor disclosure. That's going to be another 10 minutes. I'm not going to do this because I think this is a good point to end this presentation. It's also getting me possibly around some of the Sony issues where I have to get legal have to get permission from legal to talk about some of this. So I think at this point I just want to open the floor to questions. And well, actually, I'm going to jump to the conclusions. So what's interesting, if you look at this, is this whole interaction between vendors is really quite complex, right? And particularly, what do you do if you have a stack from different open source projects, and those different projects have different rules, and things might not quite fit together? This could be quite a nightmare, for vendors. A lot of projects have actually fairly opaque practices, which is not clear what they do, and it's not well documented. There's a few examples. So I think Linux distros have fairly good practices. Drupal has, but they don't do. Drupal, for example, and Mozilla have well documented practices, but it's not. They basically do public disclosure. They basically fix the thing and push it out. They don't have a pre-disclosure period. And OpenStack and some of the projects around it, like some of the Linux Foundation networking projects, are quite good and well documented. It would really be nice if there was more standardization around this across different projects. But if our experience to get to the point where we're now, where we argued over, it took us 5 years of iterative changes to get to where we're now, that would actually be quite a hard problem to solve. And then if you have multi-party disclosure, this is kind of even harder. Because we have more parties involved, there's even less standardization. There's some best practice emerging, but what we're starting to see there is that often NDAs are involved when different organizations interact with each other, because fundamentally, often commercial stakes are very high. Also, if a vendor, vendors want to cover themselves against lawsuits and so on and so forth, and you typically do that via NDAs. But that could be a problem for open source projects, because you're fundamentally then taken out of the loop. And then there's a few references, and I just wanted to open the floor for questions. Any questions? All right. Thank you.